Millennials are lazy. Gen Z doesn't want a job.
Nobody wants to work these days.
We see these claims all the time, but are they true? Would it surprise you if you found out that claims that no one wants to work these days is a tale as old as industrialism? In 2022, a thread went viral on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, which I'm never gonna call X, that demonstrated claims and moral panics about no one wanting to work actually date back to the late 1800s. While all of these claims lay the blame squarely on the shoulders of the workers, it seemed that no one ever considered the context or thought to ask the question, why would anyone want to work anymore? Which is exactly what I aim to answer in this video. To understand the moral panic about work ethic and productivity, we need to transport ourselves back to the beginning of the industrial era. The Industrial Revolution changed everything about how people worked, where they lived, and in fact, the very social fabric. With the rise of machines, a focus on productivity, and the invention of fancy things like light bulbs, work went from ruled by the sun to being ruled by the clock. Job opportunities increasingly moved into the cities, in factories, in mines, and building critical infrastructure such as railroads. You had to move goods around somehow, right? At this time, the typical worker was putting in 70 hours a week. And this included women and children who got half the pay rate as men. As work was moving into the city, this drove urbanization, and American cities rapidly grew. It goes almost without saying, but during this time, working conditions were harsh and dangerous. There was no safety protocols, no regulation, and no attention given to worker safety. Unsurprisingly, two things started to emerge during this time: labor unions and the narrative that no one wanted to work anymore. It started with the vagabond scare of the early 1870s, where migrating workers in search of employment were seen bumming around. But it was in 1894, when striking workers shut down the coal mines, that we see the narrative being said for the first time. It's become apparent that no one wants to work during these hard times. I find it interesting that was a headline instead of workers refused to be maimed and unalived at work, but go off. Eventually, unions were successful in getting better working conditions, reasonable pay, and reasonable working hours. But it wasn't just the union workers that benefited from these, everyone did. In the first few decades of the 1900s, not only did the work week decrease from 6 days to 5 days a week, we saw the average work week declining. In fact, in the 1930s, we came this close to getting a 30-hour work week. In the thick of the Great Depression, when we had record-setting unemployment, with nearly 13 million Americans out of work, the economy was in shambles. Something needed to be done. To increase the number of people working, some companies, such as the Kellogg Company, decided to take the approach of reducing the work week. The idea was to have more people working less hours. When the government copped on that an estimated 6 million jobs could be created by reducing the work week to 30 hours a week, at least temporarily, they introduced legislation to ratify this in law. This policy was incredibly popular. It even had the support of President FDR. It passed the Senate, and it was expected to pass the House. But then something happened. A teeny tiny group of people opposed it. Can you guess who? If you said capitalists, you're right. The heads of industry knew that once workers got a taste of the sweet, sweet 30-hour work week, there was no way that they were going to work more. So they lobbied against it. Some things never change. Instead of the 30-hour work week passing, FDR moved to formalize the 40-hour work week, which we have today. So when you go home at 5 instead of 3 today, you can blame FDR for that. After World War II, we had another major shift, and work moved from the factories into corporate offices. This is really where I see the rise of the American dream. We saw the rise of the middle class and men going off to work while the women stayed home. There were multiple and unequal factors that led to the rise of single-family homes that were able to afford the extras like fancy kitchen appliances. This is an era I often see glamorized in media, think Mad Men. But there were significant problems during this time, and those problems directly led to the feminist and the civil rights movements. Through the last few decades of the 20th century, corporate America evolved. Firstly, because it stopped being all white dudes, But the culture shifted as well. We had power suits, power meetings, power haircuts, and the absolute game changer that hit the market and cubicles everywhere: the personal computer. The digital revolution accelerated quickly, and in no time we had email, internet, smartphones, all of which once again dramatically transformed the way that we work. And we are going to talk about these changes in detail in just a little bit. But there was one thing that didn't change during this last period of rapid transformation in the American workforce: the American dream. The idea is still that you go to school, get a job, and achieve financial success. But is that still an option? To understand why someone wouldn't want to work anymore, we need to discuss the disappearing rewards. If we look back to the time where boomers were coming of age and establishing their lives and careers, that track worked. If you went to college, it was highly likely that you would be able to secure a good job or find a husband that would. On a single family income, you would be able to afford a home and extras. Maybe you weren't going to be flying first class on your vacations, but you would be comfortable. You even had enough to invest a little bit, which wasn't as easy to do without the internet and apps like Webull. During this time period, company loyalty was still being rewarded with things like old age pensions. And as the economy and companies grew, so did people's career prospects. This isn't to say that success was guaranteed or that life was easy, but achieving a comfortable middle-class life was accessible. If you have boomer parents like I do, you even witness this firsthand. Neither of my parents came from money, and neither of them were able to go to college, but they were able to climb the property ladder even in the days of wild inflation in the 1980s when they had 2 young children, including myself. Both my parents started their careers at the very bottom of the career ladder, but they were both able to climb and achieve remarkable success. Something that also helped my parents specifically was the fact that for a time period, my mom was a financial planner in a bank. So she budgeted, she saved, and she invested. My parents also made sure that I went to university because they wanted me to be even more successful than they were. But when we look at the data, this isn't the reality for most of the children of boomers. Over the last 40 years, the middle class has been shrinking. Salaries have stagnated since the 1960s. Even when we adjust for inflation, household income has been flattened since the 1960s. Of course, in those 60 years, the price of everything else has skyrocketed. And I'm going to come back to that point in just a minute. There is one more massive opportunity gap between older workers and younger workers today. And this is one that will determine if young people will ever be able to retire. Company pensions in the private sector have gone the way of Friendster and MySpace. Actually, I'm curious. Did you know that MySpace still exists? Well, pensions don't. Pensions have been replaced with 401ks and similar products in other countries. While many companies will match your contributions, these are still grossly inferior to company pensions. You have to administer and manage it. You do not get a guaranteed amount when you retire. And if something happens like an economic meltdown when it comes to retirement age, you're SOL. Well, what does working a few more years hurt? Of course, prior generations have also benefited from historic economical growth on their investments. Maybe that's why when you hang out with your parents, their favorite topic of conversation is their stock portfolio. Which brings us to the sad reality for kids these days. You can pay very little attention to the headlines and still know that inflation has been absolutely unhinged for the last few years. In fact, you don't have to pay attention to it at all because it shows up everywhere that you go. Like, I don't know about you, but the cost of my avocado toast and lattes has gone completely out of hand. Just kidding, I'm gluten intolerant, I don't eat toast. As the price of everything has soared, the stock market has reached new heights, bringing record profits to shareholders. But why would we want to connect those dots? Of course, there are multiple and compounding reasons why the price of everything has increased so much, several of which are perhaps rabbit holes for future videos. But the result is what I want to talk about today. Existing is expensive. It is not just the price of food, fuel, and fun that has increased. One of the most startling increases has been in home prices. Average monthly rents have reached astonishing highs. The average home purchase price has also surged, almost doubling what it was in 1980, despite the fact that household income has stagnated, which means that home ownership is increasingly inaccessible. Compounding the housing affordability crisis that we're seeing in most markets, people are entering their adult lives with a record level of debt. In transparency, when I was planning this video, I almost forgot about debt, and that is because having a financial planner mother benefited me in 2 very specific ways. ways. For starters, my parents paid for my bachelor degree, which I am eternally grateful for. It's also worth noting that I went to school in Canada, where the price of a college degree is nowhere near as bonkers as it is in the United States. When I moved to the US, I was floored by the level of student debt that people I knew had. According to the Department of Education, as of June 2023, the average student debt for federal loans was $37,650, and the total national student debt is more than $1 trillion. Trillion with a T. I feel like I read stories all the time about people whose education has stifled them with debt instead of unlocking the career opportunities that they were promised. Of course, it's not just student loan debt. Americans also carry more than $1 trillion in credit card debt, which is the second way being raised by a financial planner benefited me. I was raised to believe that credit cards needed to be paid off in full every month, but still use those credit cards and collect the points and use the purchase protection. Honestly, if it hadn't been for being raised with this belief, I undoubtedly would have racked up much more than the average $8,675 the typical New Yorker has in credit card debt. Of course, it's not just debt and the cost of housing that is financially crippling people these days. Millennials like me that have chosen to have kids have also had to navigate the crippling cost of childcare. When I went back to work after having my first baby, the cost of daycare, albeit a fancy Manhattan one, was probably more than 70% of my after-tax income, which at least made the thought of paying for an American university one day less daunting because it was pretty much the same amount. Thankfully, Sheryl Sandberg had encouraged me to lean in and take the salary hit, work for nothing to keep my spot in the workforce. Admittedly, this did work out for me, but it's not an equitable option. The cost of daycare for many exceeds their income, and if you work anything outside the typical 9-to-5 schedule, it gets really challenging to find childcare options. I thought as kids got older, it would become easier and cheaper, but as my kids reached school age, it got complicated in a lot of different ways, especially as we navigated schooling from home and lockdowns. The last few years in particular, this problem has reached new levels. During the P word, am I allowed to say schmandemic now? Millions of women were forced out of the workplace due to a lack of childcare. Personally, I was only able to work part-time up to this year because of the challenges. Data also shows us that once women step away from the workforce, they face staggering challenges to return and often have to start from the bottom all over again. Which brings me to the most unsettling reality that we are forced to face. Nothing is certain. Most millennials and Gen Zers will graduate university with staggering levels of debt. Many graduated into economies that had no jobs to offer, and entry-level jobs that are requiring 5 years of experience for some reason. Millennials like me both watched the real estate market fall apart in 2008, and then it reached unprecedented levels that it's at today. We saw the market tank during the Great Recession. Then we've seen it go batshit crazy and make absolutely no sense since 2020. We've also seen and experienced the layoffs that are piling up, which I'm also going to come back to in just a little bit. As these affordability crises rise, my hometown actually foreshadows what could happen. I grew up and I went to school in Vancouver. Aside from a few months in 2008 where things leveled off just a little tiny bit, for the last 20 years, the real estate market has been in what I can only describe as hypergrowth on steroids. While the average household income is slightly higher than $86,000, the average home sale price is more than $1.2 million. The math does not math. We are paying more for our housing, education, and life, and our salaries are not increasing to match it. Meaning workers these days have narrowing economic opportunities. But that's not all. The way we work has changed, and it started with something very simple: email. I remember when email was first popularized. Back in the day, I had a few friends that lived in faraway cities, and we would write letters back and forth. It would take like a week for a letter to get there, so it took a really long time. But then we started to get email, and I admittedly had one of those really embarrassing girly girl at whatever domain email addresses that were so popular back then. And it was amazing. I loved email. We can email much more frequently, and it felt much more instantaneous than sending a letter across the country. Though I don't think any of us actually checked our email daily, let alone minutely like a lot of people do these days. I also remember back in the 90s when email arrived in the workplace, and my dad would come home with printed off emails that he would go through to stay on top of his inbox, which, like, mad respect to the OG Inbox Zero. But for the most part, my parents were still able to enjoy the typical 9 to 5. And if there was an after-hours work call to the house, there was truly an emergency and something very dramatic was happening. But of course, it didn't stop at email. Technology continued to advance rapidly from there. Soon we had PDAs and Blackberries and secure access to our emails from wherever we were. Then iPhones with all of the apps. We got Slack, Teams, Zoom, whatever you need, it's there. Today, work is with us everywhere. As an elder millennial, I started my career during this rapid technical acceleration. I remember the novelty of being able to check my work email from home. In university, I worked in retail jobs, and it was completely novel to me to get my schedule by email instead of waiting until my next shift or having a coworker call it to me. Then I graduated, and I got a grown-up job that gave me a BlackBerry. And I had a boss who insisted we always answer his calls and emails no matter what time they arrived at. He could call you at midnight on a Friday night, and if you were not answering, you were in trouble. For obvious reasons, I quit that job pretty quickly. I don't think any of you would disagree with me when I say this constant connectivity and responsivity is the norm in the corporate world today, whether you like it or not. While we are seeing more conversations about work-life balance and even the right to disconnect legislation, that is not the norm. Everyone knows that we are glued to our phones, distracted by notifications. And if we're being honest with ourselves, being connected signals how important we are. How many times have you been out for dinner with friends or even on a date when the person just needed to answer this one message? The subtext of that action being, I'm important. Always on work culture aside, the 9 to 5 does not exist anymore. A couple of weeks ago, I ran some informal polls, and the majority of respondents indicated that they have an 8 to 5 standard, which is 45 hours a week, which brings me to how much we're working these days. Since the 1960s, the average work week has been slowly creeping up. On this, I have good news and I have bad news. Let's start with the good news. The average number of hours that Americans worked last year dropped by 37 minutes. And that brings me to the bad news, because the average American is working 10 hours a day. Of course, all of these shifts have consequences. We had the Great Resignation, we had the rise of quiet quitting, and all of the other quiet trends that we've been dealing with. It has become an active rebellion to simply go to work, do the job that you're paid to do, and work the hours you are paid to work. Meeting expectations is a revolutionary act. But before I get to that point, a quick word from our sponsor, the Career Bestie Insider. The Career Bestie Insider is my weekly newsletter where we do deep dives into the issues that are facing you at work, practical tips and strategies to accelerate your career, how to get over a toxic job, and a lot more. You'll also get sneak peeks behind the scenes to know what's going on in my head, what I'm working on, and we'll get to know each other better. Best of all, it is free to subscribe. If you want to become a Bestie Insider, go to careerbestieinsider.com and sign up. I'll see you in your inbox, and let's get back to the video. Knowing that we're working more, for annual increases that lag far behind inflation, it is no surprise that company loyalty is dead. And it's not that we have disloyal job hoppers that are just following the money, although who could blame them? Companies are no longer loyal to their employees. I mentioned earlier that during the Great Depression, many companies reduced the work week in order to maximize the overall employment rate. But what happens at the mere thought of economic turmoil these days? Last year, we saw mass layoffs in the tech industry. While many of these came out of necessity, because many companies had overhired and were over-leveraged, they needed to be able to find a way to stay afloat and to protect their investors, which is a whole other rant I could do a video on. But that was not the case for all of them. We saw some of the largest and most profitable tech companies with billions of dollars in their cash reserves, conducting layoffs the very same quarters that they were posting record profits and announcing million-dollar executive bonuses. Now we're seeing a growing trend in people recording their layoffs and those posts going wildly viral. Anecdotally, I have spoken to many people that have survived layoffs at the biggest tech companies and even at smaller companies, and I've heard a common theme from all of them. They have mentally checked out. They went from being fans of the company who were passionate about the mission to completely disengaged. Nowadays, they're showing up for the paycheck and seeing how long it lasts. With economic instability, flexibility, the rise of layoffs, and the financial upside of changing jobs, it's no wonder that job hopping has become normalized. I mean, why would you be loyal to a company that sees you as a number on a spreadsheet that could be easily terminated if it would serve the share price? Then, of course, we have the significant, sudden, and chaotic change to the way that we do work. Remote working existed prior to 2020. My first job and the job that I was rapidly promoted at Salesforce was my first job in the US in 2012. But after I left Salesforce and I went to the startup world, I was dragged back into the office. It was illogical to me. Research indicates that people are 13% more productive at home, and that number almost doubles when they're given the chance to work from home. Over the years, I talked to a lot of different tech executives about this. And the reason why they wanted people to work on site were multifaceted. Some thought it was the only way to cultivate company culture, collaboration, and connection. Others were extroverts who had a personal preference to the ambience of the office environment, while others admitted they just didn't trust people to do their jobs at home. Of course, in March 2020, it was no longer an option. All of a sudden, we were required to work from home, and companies had to quickly pivot to figure out how their employees could work from anywhere. We improvised office space in our homes, set up Zoom backgrounds, and we figured out how to deal with unruly children during our Zooms, both our own children and our colleagues. Where productivity could have ground to a halt, it increased by 10% in that time period. Deloitte released an analysis that found that the increase in productivity while working remotely came down to these three factors: efficiency, effectiveness, and empowerment. For a while, the narrative was that remote work is here to stay. We started seeing companies like Facebook or Meta or whatever the heck they want to be called these days make formal announcements that employees can permanently work remotely if they chose. Highly paid tech workers from New York and San Francisco started migrating to smaller markets, driving up the real estate prices. I have to tell you that I have a ridiculous amount of space for the fact that I live in the middle of New York City, but for a few months in lockdown, I was daydreaming on Zillow about the 10,000 square foot mansions I could buy in Ohio for less than the price of my Brooklyn townhouse. Companies were not the only ones to benefit from increased productivity when working from home, because working from home gave people better work-life balance. Without wasteful commutes, people had more time in their day. And if you can manage your laundry in between meetings, you have more free time on your own time. And you get more work done in less time when you're not being distracted by your loud coworker Brad, who for some reason has to shout into the microphone during meetings. Seriously, why does he do that? Of course, the overwhelming majority of millennials and Gen Zs want to continue working from home at least part of the time. But we can't have nice things, can we? As restrictions lifted, so did the return to office, or RTO. For a while, it really lacked traction. At the time when companies were struggling to hire workers and we had the Great Resignation going on, a return to office mandate just meant that people were going to hand in their notices. But then the job market started shifting, and layoff numbers started increasing. And with that, so did the return to office mandates. In my opinion, some of the RTO mandates were even to elicit resignations from workers. You don't have to give notice or severance packages when someone quits. Which brings us to the fundamental point of the statement that no one wants to work anymore. The connotation is that people are lazy, they don't want to work, and that there is a crisis in work ethic. At least if we believe Kim K. This premise overlooks a very simple fact. No one has ever wanted to work. There's a reason why the benefactors of general wealth have a pesky habit of losing it all. 60% of wealth transfers are entirely lost by the second generation, and 90% by the third. Either the heirs have a knack for busting up businesses, or they have no desire to work or maintain the businesses and the wealth that they have inherited. For most people, if work were optional, they would not do it. At least on the form they currently do, based on research from lottery winners. And the idea that young professionals these days are lazy is empirically false. We have already discussed how workers these days are putting in more hours in an always-on culture. But also, workers are increasingly productive. According to the Economic Policy Institute, between the years of 1979 and 2020, net productivity rose 61.8%. And in my opinion, as we see technological advancements such as machine learning and AI augment our work capacity, our productivity is going to continue to increase. It's also worth noting that we have seen an increase in side hustles and moonlighting as well. As of October 2023, 8.4 million Americans have a second job. With the cost of everything going up and wages flatlining, people have to take on more work in order to make ends meet. But even with a second job, that's not always possible. According to the US Department of Agriculture, in 2022, 12.8% of American households experienced food insecurity at some point, a number that is rising after years of decline. In addition to having multiple jobs, Americans aren't even taking breaks. According to Harvard Business Review, 60% of American workers report that they eat lunch at their desks. Perhaps another thing that's driving their productivity. In addition, there is an estimated 765 million days of paid time off that have gone unused by Americans. All of this leads me to a simple conclusion. The problem is not that no one wants to work or that we have a crisis in work ethic. The problem is that our ideals and the way that we work have not caught up with modern times. As technology develops and we stand at the beginning of the AI revolution, we need to be honest about a few things. Just like how the Industrial Revolution changed everything about the way that we work and we live, so has the digital revolution. And to survive and thrive, companies need to adapt. The problem isn't that workers don't want to do the work. The issue is that the social contract has been broken. We want what has been promised in the social contract and what was available to the generations that preceded us, and the opportunities that workers fought for in the early Industrial Revolution. We want safety, stability, and access to the rewards that have been promised to us. And wanting the delivery of that promise does not make us entitled. More than anything, I think we want our humanity to be at the center of our existence instead of our jobs. The thing is, people are increasingly aware of what was told to them was wrong, and that being lazy actually gets you further ahead. It's because the lazy people have been taught what it actually takes to get ahead without burnout or overcommitting to their work. And if you don't already know what these rules are, you need to go watch this video right now to learn them.